The grave was for Owen Marsh, and Joseph had never met Owen Marsh, and none of that stopped her from weeping. She stood at the back of the small crowd near the cemetery's stone wall, one hand resting on the cold iron of a gatepost, the October rain coming in sideways off the low hills. She was crying in the way she had learned to cry when she was 12, and living with her aunt, quietly, with her chin level, and her eyes steady, the tears simply falling rather than being wrung out of her. The headstone was pale grey granite. The flowers arranged against its base were white chrysanthemums, already bending under the water. The minister was speaking about a man she did not know, and the name in the obituary was not the name she had been repeating in her mind for the last 20 minutes. She had made a mistake. She understood this slowly, the way understanding works when the mind has already decided it knows the truth. She had heard Renata on the telephone Tuesday morning, Renata's voice carrying through the kitchen wall the way it always did when Renata forgot that the house was not entirely hers to fill with noise. A man named Marsh, the phone call had said. A service at Elwood Cemetery, Friday at 11. And Joseph had carried that fragment of information alongside the other fragment she had already formed. The name Daniel, the quiet man she had spoken with twice this week near the cemetery's side entrance. The man who had come and gone without introducing his last name. She had put two things together that did not belong together. The minister finished. The small crowd shifted. A woman in a dark coat turned toward the drive, pressing a handkerchief against her mouth. A man in a grey suit touched someone's arm and said something low. Joseph stayed where she was, her hand still on the gatepost, water dripping from the brim of her hat, and the whole weight of the last 20 minutes settling onto her chest like a stone. She thought about Daniel's hands. She had noticed them the first time they spoke, the way she noticed things that did not quite fit their context. His hands were steady in the particular way that belongs to people who have spent time making decisions, not following them. He had been sitting on the bench near the groundskeeper's shed, watching the birch trees at the cemetery's edge, and when she had come through the side gate with her arms full of floral arrangements for a neighbouring grave, he had stood without being asked and held the gate open for her. Just that. No remark. He had simply risen, held the gate, and settled back to the bench when she passed. She had said, "Thank you," and he had nodded once. The second time was Wednesday. She had come back to trim the edges of the grave plot she maintained for Renata's household, a task that fell to her because it had always fallen to her, one of the accumulated duties of 6 years in a position that had started as household manager and expanded gradually into whatever Renata decided the position should contain on any given morning. Daniel was there again, near the groundskeeper's shed, reading something in a small cloth-covered notebook. He had looked up when she arrived and said, "The rain is supposed to hold until 4. She had said, "I know, I checked." He had almost smiled. She had felt it as warmth even though she had not looked at him long enough to confirm it. That was the whole of what she had built a death out of. She turned away from the grave as the last of the mourners walked toward their cars, and she nearly walked into Clara Whitfield, who was standing 6 feet behind her with a rake in one hand, and the steady, unhurried expression of someone who has watched enough human behavior in a cemetery to have lost most of her capacity for surprise. Clara was the head groundskeeper at Elwood, 61 years old, with soil permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles, and the blunt, practical way of speaking that comes from spending most of one's days in the company of the quiet. She had known Joseph since the year Joseph first started maintaining the Marsh family plot, 6 years back, and she had the habit of appearing at exactly the moments when appearing was useful. "You've got the wrong service," Clara said. She said it without drama, the way she might note that Joseph had the wrong plot number. "I know," Joseph said. "Owen Marsh died Monday. Clara said. "His brother is standing behind you." Joseph turned around. Daniel was standing 40 feet away, near the birch trees at the cemetery's east wall, his hands in the pockets of a dark jacket that was not a morning coat, but was close enough to be mistaken for one in certain light. He was watching her, not in the way that felt like surveillance, but in the way that felt like he had been watching for some time and had not decided yet what to do about it. The rain fell between them for a moment. She did not know what he had seen. She understood, retroactively, that whatever he had seen included her weeping at a service for his brother, while apparently believing it was a service for him. And something about that particular configuration of facts made her face go very warm very quickly. He crossed the distance between them at a measured pace, not hurrying, not hesitating. "You came," he said. She could not tell from those two words whether he knew what had happened or whether he was simply acknowledging her presence. She chose to treat it as acknowledgement only. "I'm sorry about your brother," she said. He accepted that with a nod. One of his quiet nods, the kind she had already catalogued, each one meaning slightly different things. This one meant received and thank you, and something else that she couldn't name. They stood in the October rain for a minute longer. She should have left. She had 3 hours of work ahead of her before she was expected back at the house, and Renata had made clear that morning that the household's schedule would not be adjusted for the funeral of someone outside the family's immediate circle, regardless of what Joseph might feel entitled to. But she stayed another few minutes because Daniel was standing there, and because his brother was in the ground 20 yards away, and because she was, underneath all her practical management of the day's tasks, someone who found it genuinely difficult to leave a grieving person standing alone in the rain. She was also, if she was honest, still sorting out what had happened inside her chest during the 20 minutes she had spent believing she was mourning him. 6 years inside Renata's household had given Joseph a very precise education in what it felt like to be treated as a function rather than a person. Renata was Owen's older sister, which made her, by her own accounting, the appropriate custodian of the Marsh family's domestic arrangements, social calendar, and general standards of behavior. She had hired Joseph on the recommendation of an agency, had established on the first day what the position entailed, and had never substantially revised that understanding in the years since. Joseph managed the house on Carver Street. She coordinated the staff, organized the family's social obligations, maintained correspondence, handled the logistics of the seasonal household changes, and served as the first and last line of administrative control for everything from the florist's account to the insurance documents stored in the cabinet beside Renata's desk. She did the work carefully. She had always done it carefully, not because she required praise for care, but because she was incapable of doing it any other way. Renata treated her the way a person treats a well-functioning appliance. Not with cruelty, exactly, not the conscious, targeted kind, but with a persistent, comfortable certainty that Joseph's function defined her value, and that her value was precisely what she was used for on any given day. When Joseph made a decision correctly, Renata registered the result and moved on. When Joseph made a decision that Renata would have made differently, Renata corrected her, in exactly the tone and volume she would have used to point out that a window had been left open. 3 weeks before Owen died, Renata had held a small family dinner for her cousins who had come from Portland. Joseph had organized the meal, coordinated with the kitchen, laid the table with the good linen, and the Wedgwood that only came out for family. When the cousins arrived and remarked on the arrangement, Renata had said, "I wanted everything to be right," and returned the conversation to its previous thread. Joseph, carrying the last of the serving pieces in from the kitchen, had heard this from the doorway. She had set the piece down on the sideboard and gone back to the kitchen and finished the evening. She did not make a production of things like this. She had learned, somewhere between the first year and the second, that making a production of things in Renata's household produced nothing except the designation of being difficult, and being difficult was a category from which it was essentially impossible to recover in Renata's estimation. So she absorbed what needed to be absorbed. She maintained her own inner accounting of what was true, and she continued to do her work with the same care she had always brought to it. What she had not learned, even after 6 years, was how to stop noticing when a stranger treated her like a person. The bench near the groundskeeper's shed was where she had left her bag on Wednesday, under the shed's narrow overhang to keep it out of the rain. When she went back for it after standing with Daniel, Clara was sitting on the bench in her place, the rake leaning against the shed wall, a thermos of something warm open in her lap. "He comes every week," Clara said without Joseph asking. "Has done for about 2 months, since his brother got sick." She poured something into the thermos cap. "Sits, reads, never makes trouble." Joseph picked up her bag. She adjusted the strap. "Does he work nearby?" she said. Clara looked at her in the particular way she had of looking at people when she was deciding how much to say. "Not nearby," she said. Then she handed Joseph the thermos cap, which was full of coffee, and picked up her rake, and that was the end of the conversation. Joseph drank the coffee standing up. It was black and very strong. She held the warmth of the cup between her palms and watched a wren pick its way along the base of the stone wall, and she thought about nothing in particular for approximately 3 minutes, which was more nothing than she had allowed herself in several weeks. Renata arrived at the house on Carver Street on Thursday morning with the news that Owen had revised his will in September, that there was to be a reading on the following Monday at the estate attorney's offices, and that Joseph would need to organize the tea service for after, because there would be family present, and appearances had to be maintained. She said all of this on her way through the front hall, coat still buttoned, not stopping, the information delivered over her shoulder the way Renata delivered most information that she considered administrative rather than personal. Joseph wrote it down in the household notebook. She noted the attorney's name, the time, the number of expected attendees, and the instruction about the tea service. She did not ask why she was being asked to provide refreshments for a legal proceeding. She noted the date and the time and turned the page. That evening she was in the butler's pantry cataloguing the silver when she heard Renata in the adjacent sitting room, the door imperfectly closed, talking to someone on the telephone. Renata's voice was clear and specific, the way it was when she was not performing for an audience and simply saying what she meant. "She's been here 6 years, Renata said. "She's perfectly competent. But once the estate is settled and I don't have the house to manage, there's simply no position for her. I'll keep her through the end of the month." A pause, long enough that Joseph could hear the silver she was holding give a faint ring in her hand, the sound of her grip tightening. "She's not family," Renata continued. "She's a charity case who has outstayed the original arrangement. I'll be very fair about the severance, but she needs to understand that her situation is temporary." The pantry was small. The shelves were close. The silver was cold. Joseph stood where she was for another 30 seconds. She set the piece she was holding back on its cloth. She closed the drawer. She turned off the pantry light and walked upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. And she did not cry the way she had cried in the cemetery, because this was a different kind of hurt, the kind that does not produce tears, but produces a particular stillness in the chest. She had known, abstractly, that the position was not permanent. She had always known this, the way one knows things that have not been said aloud, but are present in the architecture of a situation. What she had not known was that Renata had already decided, and had already used the word charity, and had already constructed the sentence that made 6 years of careful, unglamorous work into a temporary arrangement that Joseph had mistaken for belonging. She did not sleep well. On Friday she rose at the usual time, laid the usual breakfast, and managed the usual mourning. The house was very quiet. Renata had gone to pay respects at the funeral home early. Joseph worked through the breakfast things, the mail sorting, the accounts update that was due at the end of the week. And then, at 10:30, she changed out of her work clothes and put on her dark coat and her black-brimmed hat and walked the 7 blocks to Elwood Cemetery. She was not sure entirely why she went. She had told herself it was to maintain the family plot, which was not due for maintenance, but which gave her a reason to be at the cemetery that would be legible to anyone who asked. She had also told herself that attending the service of Owen Marsh, who had lived in this house and whose family she had served for 6 years, was a reasonable expression of respect, even if no one would notice the expression. She had not examined the third reason, which had to do with Daniel and the bench and the coffee Clara had poured into a thermos cap on a Wednesday afternoon. The last of the funeral crowd was moving toward the car park when she arrived at the side gate. She had the floral trimmings she'd promised herself as a cover story in her arms. The gate latch was stiff, the way it always was when the iron had been cold and wet for several hours. She was wrestling it with her elbow when she heard someone behind her say, "Can I get that?" It was a different man, not Daniel. A young man, perhaps 25, in a plain dark coat, carrying an umbrella he wasn't using despite the rain, because he was using both hands to check his phone. He looked cold and slightly hurried, and faintly miserable in the specific way of people who have travelled some distance for an obligation they were dreading. Joseph looked at the umbrella and then at the rain and then at the young man's coat, which was already darkening at the shoulders. She shifted her floral trimmings to one arm. She held out her own umbrella, the compact black one she had carried that morning, which she had already opened against the rain, and which was doing serviceable work keeping her dry. "Take this," she said. "The gate opens inward. You push it." The young man looked at her, then at the umbrella. "I couldn't," he said. "You're going to be standing at a graveside in 20 minutes and your jacket is already wet," she said. "Take it." He took it. He opened the gate. He went through toward the service, already faintly less miserable around the eyes. Joseph followed with her armful of cold flowers and her hat doing reasonable work against the rain and her coat getting wet at the collar, which she had expected. She did not notice Daniel behind the stone wall at the cemetery's eastern edge, 15 feet from the gate. The service was nearly over by the time she reached the family plot. She stood at the back. She registered the obituary name and felt the slow, cold understanding arrive. And then she wept, and then Clara appeared behind her and said what Clara said, and then she turned around, and Daniel was there. She had given away her umbrella. The rain had been coming for about 25 minutes at that point. She was fairly wet. She was standing at the back of the attendees' scatter with her arms at her sides, composure in place, and Daniel crossed the 40 feet of cemetery path toward her, with his dark jacket and his steady hands, and the careful way he moved through a space without disturbing it. "You came," he said. Later, when she knew everything, she would think about those 2 words quite differently. She would understand that he had seen her give away the umbrella at the gate. He had been watching before that from the eastern wall, and he had seen her arrive and give the umbrella to a stranger without asking anything in exchange, and then stand in the rain through his brother's funeral because she had believed it was his. She would understand that he had carried all of this with him through the 10 minutes she stood composing herself before he walked over. But on Friday afternoon, in the rain, she knew none of this. She thanked him for his brother. He accepted it. They stood in the rain. She left when she had stood long enough. The estate attorney's office was a ground-floor suite on Aldermore Street, the kind that announces its purpose through a brass plate on a dark wood door, and a waiting room with 2 blue chairs, and a side table with a lamp that was on even in daylight. The attorney was a man named Gerard Amos, who had the unhurried, contained manner of someone accustomed to rooms that were already full of feeling when he entered them. Joseph arrived 8 minutes early on Monday. She had the tea service on a wheeled cart from the household, because Renata had wanted the refreshments on hand before the reading began, and because the attorney's suite had a small connecting room with a counter where things could be laid out. She positioned the cups and the pot and the plate of shortbread that she had made herself that morning, because the bakery Renata normally used was closed for a family illness. She aligned everything with the care she brought to all of it. The room smelled of the lilies she had put in a low vase on the sideboard, because the meeting room felt cold without something living in it. Renata arrived at 5 past, with 2 cousins and a family friend, whose name Joseph did not know. She acknowledged Joseph's presence with the brisk nod that meant the arrangements were acceptable, and settled into the chair at the head of the table as though the reading were a meeting she was chairing. The 2 cousins took seats. The family friend stood near the window. Gerard Amos came in at precisely the appointed time with a folder and a pair of reading glasses, and the expression of a man about to do his job. Joseph was supposed to withdraw to the connecting room. She had taken 2 steps toward the connecting room doorway when the outer office door opened again and Daniel came in. He was wearing a jacket that was not the dark one from the cemetery. It was a wool coat, charcoal grey, the kind of simple, well-made thing that sits on a person differently than its cost would suggest, because it has been worn long enough to fit them. He had his notebook in one hand. He was moving in the unhurried way that she had catalogued from the bench near the groundskeeper's shed, the way that looked like a man with time, and turned out to be a man who had given himself permission to take it. Renata looked up from her folder. Something crossed her face that Joseph had never seen there before. A recalibration, quick and involuntary, the kind that happens when a person has organized a room around an assumption that has suddenly required revision. Daniel sat down. Renata said, "I was not aware you would be attending," he said. "Owen wanted me here." The way he said it left no opening. Gerard opened his folder. He looked around the table, confirmed the attendees, and settled his glasses onto his nose with the practiced gesture of a man who has done this exact thing in this exact quality of room many hundreds of times. "The estate of Owen Marsh," he said. He read through the preliminary language with the measured pace of someone reading language that requires witnessing rather than dramatic presentation. He named the property on Carver Street. He named the accounts. He named 3 beneficiaries, the number that had been established from Owen's September revision. Joseph, still standing in the 2 steps between the table and the connecting room doorway, was preparing to finish her quiet exit. Then Gerard said, "The majority interest in the Marsh Group, comprising controlling shares in all subsidiary holdings, and the primary designation over all estate decisions requiring active management, is assigned to Daniel Marsh." The room changed. It did not change loudly. There was no raised voice, no gasp, no dramatic reversal of chairs. What changed was the quality of the air, the specific way that attention reorganizes itself when a piece of information reconfigures what everyone believed they understood about the geometry of a room. Renata set her pen down. Her hand stayed where it was for a moment, the pen between her fingers, and then her fingers opened and the pen touched the table, and her hand went to her lap. Daniel did not say anything. He was looking at Gerard. His expression was composed in the same way it had been at the cemetery, and at the bench by the groundskeeper's shed, and in every moment she had observed him, completely himself, entirely unperformative, present. Joseph had not moved. Renata looked at Gerard first, and then at Daniel, and then something in the organized presentation of her face came loose at one point, the area around the eyes, where the certainty of 6 years of knowing the exact shape of the room began to show its revision in real time. "I wasn't aware," she said, "that Owen had made any substantive revision of this nature." "He revised in September," Gerard said. The word substantial landed in the room without interpretation. "Daniel and Owen were not," Renata said, and then she stopped. The sentence was not finished. It had the structure of a sentence that had expected a conclusion and arrived at the place where the conclusion should be and found the conclusion was no longer available to it. She said, "I see," instead, which was not the truth, but was the only thing left. The reading continued. The smaller allocations were distributed. Gerard moved through the language with the same unhurried care. Renata's pen did not move again. One of the cousins looked at his hands. The family friend at the window had shifted to face the room at some point, without Joseph noticing exactly when. When Gerard finished, he looked around the table in the way that indicated the formal portion was concluded, and the room was now in its own custody. Renata looked at Daniel for the first time since her unfinished sentence. Her voice had come back to something close to its usual register, although flatter, the confidence present, but with the certainty gone out of it. "I will want to discuss the Carver Street arrangements," she said. The current staff is not under review," Daniel said. The flatness with which he said it was not unkind. It was the same flatness as his nods at the cemetery. The minimum sufficient expression of a conclusion that was already made and did not require discussion. Renata looked at Joseph. It was, Joseph thought afterward, possibly the first time Renata had looked at her directly in 6 years. Not at her work, not at the result of her presence, not at the function she was performing, but at her. The look lasted a full 3 seconds. Something moved in it that Joseph could not entirely name, possibly the motion of a person who has reached the end of a very long assumption and found the assumption was wrong. "She's been here 6 years, Daniel said. He was not looking at Renata. He was looking at the folder in front of him, the same notebook from the bench, and he said it with the same quietness with which he said everything. "Her position is not yours to decide." There was a silence that lasted the length of time it takes for a sentence to be fully heard. Renata said nothing. She gathered her folder. She pushed back from the table with the movements of a woman who has practiced composure her entire life and is drawing on every last portion of that practice. She thanked Gerard. She acknowledged the cousins. She moved to the door with her coat held in front of her like a shield, and she went through it. The cousins followed after a brief pause. The family friend said a quiet word to Gerard and left. The room was quiet. Daniel closed his notebook. He looked up, and the first person he looked at was Joseph, who was still standing in the 2 steps between the table and the connecting room doorway, her hands at her sides, her face doing what her face did when she was absorbing something she needed time to carry correctly. He said, "I didn't plan for it to go exactly that way." She said, "Did you plan for any of it to go any particular way?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some of it," he said. She thought about 2 conversations near a cemetery gate. She thought about a bench and a thermos cap full of strong coffee. She thought about standing in the rain for 25 minutes believing the wrong thing, and what she had felt during those 25 minutes, the specific quality of grief that had arrived, and what it told her about things she had not finished examining. She said, Clara told me you come every week. I did, he said. Owen and I lost about 8 years to a disagreement we both waited too long to end. He looked at the folder again. I came because I couldn't come when it would have mattered, and this was what was left. She understood this. She understood it not as a piece of information, but as a thing she recognized. The way you recognize a country you've never visited because someone described it once with enough accuracy. She said, I spoke at the grave. Friday, after the service, I came back alone. She said it plainly, not as a confession, just as a fact she was offering. I said things I thought no one would hear. He was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own sentence. I know, he said. She looked at him. Clara told me, he said. Not the words, just that you came back. She did not ask if he had come back too. She looked at the lilies on the sideboard, their scent mild and steady in the room, and she thought about what it had cost her to speak honestly at a stone she believed held the only person in several years who had seen her, without needing her, to be something. Daniel picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He did not put it on immediately. He held it and looked at the table as though finishing a thought that had started somewhere much earlier. The position on Carver Street, he said, if you'd want to stay. She said, I've been there 6 years. I know, he said. That's not an answer. She looked at him. The light in the attorney's office was low and yellow, the lamp on the side table doing most of the work, and it picked up the patience in his face, the steadiness that had struck her the first time from a distance and the second time close enough to catch the detail of it. Yes, she said, I'd want to stay. He nodded. The nod meant something this time that she did not try to name because naming it would have required language she was not ready to use inside a room where the tea was still warm and the lilies were still standing and the afternoon was still going. There was time. She felt for the first time in a long while that there was time. Clara had been waiting on the bench by the groundskeeper's shed when Joseph stopped by the cemetery on her way back, because Clara had a way of being where she was useful, and this was one of those days. She had 2 cups of coffee already poured. She handed one to Joseph and held the other in her own 2 hands and looked out at the birch trees, which had dropped half their leaves by now and were showing their pale bark against the grey October sky. He asked me about you the second week he came, Clara said. She said it in the same voice she said most things, plain and unfussy, like weather reports. Didn't ask directly. Asked how long the family plot had been maintained. Asked if the work was done by the house or by an outside service. She drank her coffee. I said a woman who'd worked for the family for a long time did it herself because she thought it deserved the attention. Joseph held her cup. The warmth went into her palms. He said, Does she come regularly? Clara continued. I said yes. He came the following week at the same time. Joseph thought about this. She thought about the timing of the bench, the particular Wednesday afternoon, the notebook in his hand that might have been there, or might have been a reason to be sitting quietly on a bench in a cemetery without it looking like waiting. He could have introduced himself, she said. People with things to hide usually can't, Clara said, and people with things to lose usually won't. She looked at Joseph sideways. He had both. Joseph finished her coffee. She handed Clara the cup back. She looked at the birch trees, their pale bark, the rain-cleaned air around them. She thought about what she had said aloud at Owen's grave, standing alone in the cold after everyone else had gone, believing no one was close enough to hear. She had said, I don't know if you could tell from wherever you were that someone was sorry for the time you lost. I hope you could. She had said, the people who matter usually don't know they matter until the window is already closed. She had said, I think you had someone who was sorry before the end. I think he came every week. She had said all of this to a granite stone in an empty cemetery, with her hat in her hands and her feet cold, and the last of the afternoon going out of the sky. Clara had not told her whether Daniel had been within earshot on Friday. She decided, for the time being, not to ask. There were things that were better left inside their own moment, not examined into transparency, but carried at a particular weight. The weight of things that happened when you were not trying to be seen, and that found their way to the right person, regardless. She walked back to Carver Street in the early evening, the light going amber over the rooftops. She walked the 7 blocks with her coat collar turned up and her hat straight on her head and her hands in her pockets, and she thought about the shape of the next few weeks. The estate settling, the household resuming its ordinary rhythm, the adjustment to what ordinary meant now that the room had been reordered. She thought about what Renata would do with the authority she had been quietly building for 6 years against the particular wall that had now been removed. Renata would adjust, the way people who have always lived inside structures adjust when the structures change, not with warmth, but with pragmatism, with the recognition that the room now had a different configuration, and the configuration required different behavior. She would not be kind to Joseph in any new way. She might possibly be more careful. That was enough. That had always been enough. The Carver Street house was lit in the front room when she arrived. She could see the lamp Renata kept on in the parlour, the one she didn't turn off until she went to bed. The front walk was wet with the afternoon's rain, the stones dark and slick. The box hedge along the walk had lost some leaves in the last few days, and there were small, wet clusters of them against the base of the stone steps. Joseph took the 3 steps up to the front door. She reached for the handle. Before she went in, she turned and looked down the street, the amber-lit wet evening, the quiet houses, the particular stillness of a neighbourhood at the end of an afternoon. On the hook beside the front door, just inside, hung the umbrella. She had not expected it there. She had given it away at the cemetery gate on Friday. She had not thought about it since. But it was there, her compact black umbrella hanging on the second hook from the top, dry now, folded neatly, as though it had always lived there and had only been temporarily elsewhere. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not quite inside and not quite out, the warm light of the hall behind her and the wet evening in front of her. She understood what it meant, or she understood enough. She stepped across the threshold and closed the door behind her.